Hello, if you're new here, my name is Max. I write and analyze books under the name Gemma Tate, and today I want to talk about Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I know, a lot of y'all started watching my videos for the Hunger Games breakdowns and critical analysis of that, but we can talk like that about other books too, including ones that your English teacher probably wanted you to read. Whether or not you actually did is none of my business. And I know, I did a poll. Percy Jackson won the poll for which book I should talk about next. And A Series of Unfortunate Events is in second place. But listen. That is a pentology with companion novellas, followed by another pentology, or it is a 13-book series with prequels and side novellas. So it's going to take me a while to figure out how to best conceptualize the best way to put that information out to you. I have not figured out how to turn that into a video yet. So we're going to talk about this one standalone book that has been out since 1953 and which I have studied in school twice, just as a starting point. And y'all already know this book is about book bans and book burnings and the death of intellectualism. But here's the thing. This is not a book about censorship. It's not. You think it is. It isn't. It's a book about the death of the American attention span. And in some ways, it's also about throwing away books in favor of endless doom scrolling, which is interesting because Ray Bradbury, I don't think, knew what the hell doom scrolling was in 1953. But it's a really good in-depth look at how somebody can go from just doing their job, complicit in a bad system, to being fully and completely radicalized and fighting against that system for the purpose of preserving knowledge and empathy and humanity in a world that prioritizes mechanics and machines and screens over human creativity. Now, let's be clear. This is not 1984 by George Orwell. It carries themes of resisting authority and questioning mass exploitation, yes, but Bradbury's primary purpose in writing it had more to do with him being really upset at the endless watching of screens and the fracturing of attention spans. There's a rumor that once he was doing a lecture at UCLA, and he walked out of the lecture because people kept insisting that his book was about censorship when he didn't mean it that way. And I think that it's actually more important when we look at this book in a context like the canon of the Hunger Games books, which are about resisting authority, or in the context of our modern world, where it's not necessarily about censorship. It's a question of people dumbing themselves down and replacing stories and books and points of genuine connection with reality TV and with endless scrolling and clicking. And in reality, this is a book about people getting offended over nothing, getting offended over a lack of sameness, literally being offended by diversity, and demanding that the government destroy offensive media or media that they found offensive to them. And eventually people getting so sensitive to things being unlike themselves that the only thing left is meaningless entertainment. And the parallels to today are uncomfortable. So let's get into it. And I think we're just going to go chapter by chapter. We're going to start off with chapter 1, The Hearth and the Salamander, part 1. And I think that we should look at that title real quick, because what's a hearth? A hearth is the part of the fireplace where you make yourself at home, right? It's the place where you sit with your cup of tea and you're warm and you're cozy and everything is nice. It's also a place that houses a fire. And what's a salamander? I mean, it's a little lizard that lives in your water, sure. In the context of mythology, it's also an animal that theoretically lives in fire and is unaffected by fire. It's kind of a stand-in for a dragon. A salamander is also an amphibian. They're a lot like frogs. And so instantly, this title makes me think about what happens when you put a frog in a fire. Like, that's a metaphor, right? You boil a frog by putting it in the cold water and slowly turning the temperature up and up and up. And then the frog has been boiled and didn't even notice it happening until it was too late. So the opening line of this book tells us that Montag, our main character, has not begun to question things, has not begun to pick apart a single thing. Opening line, it was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. For Montag, the important thing about burning books isn't destruction, it's change. And throughout this whole chapter, he sort of talks about how he doesn't like things that he doesn't understand. He has had some uncertain feelings and he's mad about it. So burning things is cathartic for him. And in a lot of ways, he is the product of a society that has dumbed itself down. He has a community, such that community exists in this book. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And he has the respect of the people around him. So he finds it really, really weird when his teenage neighbor, Clarice, has no respect for him, no respect for his profession, no respect for his position. And there is a question of the extent to which community exists in this society as presented in Fahrenheit 451. Even religion, church, gathering places, that is totally encompassed by literally being able to put Jesus on your TV screen. Meanwhile, neighbor girl Clarice wants to be outside, wants to see what the butterflies are doing or go for a hike. And that makes her weird in this society that is just obsessed with screens. And all of the descriptions of her and her house have to do with light. She is pale in a world that is dark. She has a house that's always lit up when the other ones are dark at night. And I really want to talk about that point that her house is light when the other ones are all dark. And that's a really intense juxtaposition. And when you picture it, it almost makes you think of a house that is on fire. Because on the one hand, you have warm, cozy light, like what you'd find in a hearth, that is not the bright fluorescence of screens. And that's cozy, it's nice. But in the context of this book, it is also dangerous. And so much of the language used to talk about Clarice is about light and dark, or a light in the dark, which in some ways foreshadows both what she is to Montag and also exactly what happens to her. And Clarice is already starting to question some of the mythology that it has not occurred to Montag to question at all. She asks, is it true that long ago firemen put fires out instead of going to start them? And Montag says, no, houses have always been fireproof, take my word for it. And Clarice says, strange, I heard that once a long time ago houses used to burn by accident and they needed firemen to stop the flames. And Montag starts laughing, like this is ridiculous to him. And as we get a little bit further into this book, it becomes really clear that not only is there just this assumption that things are the way that they have always been because it's the way they have always been, but also that people don't talk to other people enough to come up with reasons to question it. Back to that note about community and a lack thereof, Montag goes home to his wife, Mildred, and she refers to the people on her interactive parlor walls, which have been written with one part missing so that the viewer, her, can read the lines out and feel like a part of the action on her screen. Mildred refers to that as her family. Even Jesus, again, church, traditionally a gathering place, a place to connect with other people, is a TV program. People have stopped interacting like people. Mildred always has earbuds in, to the point where Montag, who is married to her, has grown used to just not interacting with her. And let's talk about the really big revelation of chapter 2, which is emotional regulation pills, or antidepressants, and mood regulators that people take in this town. And Mildred, in this chapter, fully overdoses. She has to get her stomach pumped and her blood replaced, and it is treated by everybody on the stage as a normal occurrence. This is just a thing that happens here. Real human emotions, like human connection, are just anathema to existing in this place. So community exists in the sense that there are people and a process to take care of Mildred's physical issue of having overdosed. But absolutely no one of the first responders who show up with what Montag calls the snake pause to ask why Mildred took all of these pills, or to give her follow-up instructions for how not to overdose again. And nobody suggests treatment. She just goes right back to it the next day. The snake is not a foreign process to this household or seemingly any others. And this is where we start to get some of the descriptive phrases that Montag uses, like not alive, but indeed alive, not empty, but indeed empty. The people, just like the snake, are mechanized. This is also how Montag describes people, here but not here, alive but not alive. And it's also how he ends up describing a good bit of the technology throughout the book. The snake, the mechanical hound. And I think that it's worth noting, nature is a thing in so much that it exists. There are blades of grass, there are trees. But Clarice is considered odd. She's considered weird for liking to be outside. But the trucks are salamanders. The stomach pump is a snake. The hound is a hound. And it's a really clever replacement process that makes it feel very normalized that everything is technological, everything is mechanical, because you don't necessarily notice the absence of something if you take something different and rename it after the thing that is actually missing. In this case, elements of nature, animals, things that aren't human. And so this brings us to chapter 3, which is about the hound. Montag describes it immediately as like a dog, alive but not. And Montag in this chapter starts to do something really interesting. He starts to do his job but not. He starts to look inside books before burning them. And in this chapter, right when he's starting to question things, right after he's had this conversation with Clarice, the other firemen at his firehouse start to tease him. They start to talk to him about this fireman in Seattle who committed suicide by setting a mechanical hound to his own chemical complex. And Beatty, his own fire chief, assures Montag that nobody would have ever done that to him, and he'll have the hound checked out because the hound is starting to growl at Montag. The hound is starting to not like him. And it is worth noting, Montag's own chemical composition is to some extent starting to change because of his own suspicions, because of his own concerns. And over the next week, Montag sees Clarice outside and he talks with her every single day. He goes from never having interacted with her before in his life to talking to her every day. And she asks him, hey, why didn't you ever have any kids? I stopped going to school. It was mindless and routine, but why don't you have kids? Why don't you have kids who go to school? And Montag starts to really think about it. He starts to realize that he doesn't know. He doesn't know why he's doing any of the things that he's doing. His days are routine and they're mindless. And finally, on the 8th day, he goes to talk to her and she's not there. And then his train arrives and he doesn't really have time to question it and he goes to work. And then he starts asking her questions. He asked, did firemen ever prevent fires? Was our purpose ever anything other than to burn things? And 2 firemen take out their little rule books and they start to tell him about the history of firemen. The firemen of America were established in 1790 by Benjamin Franklin to burn English-influenced books. So we begin to get this supplanting of information through omission and through twisting facts and figures and familiar names from history to fit a narrative. And that's really important because Bradbury, again, insisted that this was not a book about censorship, but we can read it that way, especially because the firemen have rule books. They can read their rule books. The rules apply to some, but also to all, but really only to some. To borrow from a different dystopian author who did write about censorship, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. No texts can be read except for the ones telling you what not to read. And in this process, Montag goes about his normal, everyday routine. He goes to a woman's house, and her house is full of old books. It's described as a decrepit old house with an attic that is stuffed full of books. And in this chapter, Montag, with all the rest of his firemen, they go to burn her house, and Montag takes a book. He doesn't know what comes over him. He just does it. He takes a book. And the woman stays with her library. She chooses to self-immolate. She chooses to burn up with her books rather than live in a world without them. And Montag's immediate thought is, oh, if she's willing to do that, then there must be something of value here. And he doesn't quite know what he's deconstructing yet. He doesn't really know why he's doing this. He just does it. He takes the book. And this is the thing. Montag's days are routine. There are always books to burn. So we sort of start to get this sense that maybe there has been more of a rebellion here than Montag has sensed before. Maybe we are not so far into this process that society has gone through where books have become illegal and where having independent thought is not normal. Maybe we are not so far into this as Montag thinks we are. And maybe, just maybe, that is what Beatty is alluding to when he talks about insanity and people needing to be told what to think. And Beatty says, you must understand that our civilization is so vast. You must ask yourself, what do we want in this country? People want to be happy. Don't we keep them moving? Don't we give them fun? You must admit that our culture provides plenty of fun. And Beatty is a true believer. He doesn't lean into, oh, it's always been this way, you have to preserve the natural order. He's a revolutionary. He's comparing books which contain thousands of varying opinions to the Tower of Babel, jumbling opinions into a million variations, forcing disagreement. And he says, colored people don't like Little Black Sambo, burn it. White people don't feel good about Uncle Tom's Cabin, burn it. Someone's written a book on tobacco and the cancer of the lungs, the cigarette people are weeping, burn the book. Serenity, Montag. Peace, Montag. Take your fight outside. Better yet, into the incinerator. Funerals are unhappy and pagan, eliminate them too. And Beatty makes it really clear, if you're paying attention, that he knows a whole lot more about what's going on than he's been letting on. Like maybe he knows that that warped history about the firemen of America isn't true. And he says that book burning is helpful because society needs to be dumbed down. But here's the thing. Beatty's not dumbing himself down. The little old woman, when her home burns down with all of her books inside, she says, play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. And Montag doesn't know what the hell this lady's talking about, but Beatty clocks it, and he says, oh, that's actually a quotation of Hugh Latimer to Nicholas Ridley, because the two of them were about to be burned at the stake as heretics in England in 1555. And that quote, I also want to bring us back to that. Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. Because again, we've got fire imagery and we've got a reference to a God that has never seen a screen, lighting a candle, not a blaze, a candle for prayer. And also, Latimer and Ridley were burned together for the sake of something that they cared about, totally counter to the generally accepted apathy of the society of this time. And Beatty clocks it. Beatty knows what she's talking about. And individual agency, I think, comes into play here too. We've got the woman with her books choosing to burn with them. We've got Beatty having read these books, being able to quote them. And we've got Montag slowly realizing that stealing a book is the first conscious choice that he has maybe ever made in his entire life. And through this process, he starts to realize all of the other firemen look exactly like him. They all have the same uniform. They all train the same way. They have the same physique. They have what he calls their grafted on sooty smiles. And it's a physical manifestation of the way that society demands that everybody think and act the same. It's sameness that has become the constant of his days, way more than the rule of law or passion or true routine. And that is part of what makes Clarice interesting. She's a disruption, not just to the way of thought that Montag has ascribed to for his whole life, but a disruption to the routine because she is outside when he comes home. She is there to talk to. And then when she's missing, that's a routine that Montag has become fond of, stopping and talking with her. And when she's missing, that is another disruption. So we have routine and the disruption of it, and it is just enough to shake Montag loose from this ideology that he's been complicit in for, as far as we know, his entire adult life. So then we get into chapter 4, and this is where things start to get really a little bit rough for Montag, because his wife, Mildred, spends all of her time within her 3 TV walls, and she starts really pushing Montag to get a 4th wall, because that would box her in completely. She would never have to leave her screens. And she starts calling the people on the TV her family, and she says that she values them and their company more than she values Montag's. She says it. And her life of watching TV has destroyed her attention span. She cannot comprehend what is happening in the programs that she watches, which, by the way, sounds suspiciously like what is happening to today's iPad kids. But she is so disconnected from reality that she forgets. It does not stay in her brain long enough to tell Montag that Clarice was killed and her family moved away. And then when she does remember to tell him, she doesn't even consider that that news might be upsetting to Montag. And Montag looks down at his hands, his soot-covered hands, and registers that, like, maybe he should quit his job. So what's up with the iPad kid of it all? Because it's not that this book was predicting the future. Remember, people do not write effective dystopias about what they think is going to happen. They write them about what is already happening. And, like, we didn't have iPads in 1953 when this book came out. But we had TVs and we had radios, and those things were working their way into every home. And as a result, we did start to see declining book sales and lessening interest in libraries. I think it is important to remember, Bradbury famously wrote this book in 10-cent increments on a rented library typewriter. Access to books, access to long-form processes, these things are really important to Bradbury. And Montag realizes in this chapter, after he has burned a home with a woman inside of it, that books are kind of a tangible representation of somebody's entire life and work. And he starts to really think, and he goes, wow, I wonder if there is some deeper truth buried underneath the lies and the simple pleasures that we seem to spend all of our time in search of. And it's really easy to see that as Bradbury's response to books being tossed aside for TV and radio programming. And Bradbury didn't exactly predict like generative AI writing Fourth Wing knockoffs, but I think that the criticism works anyway. And so then we get into this space where Montag is really questioning everything about the world around him, but he still has to go to work. And then we get Beatty's explanation of fireman work, why they do what they do. And it comes down to this idea that I think is actually why a lot of people really don't like the book. This idea that everybody read too much and minorities had identities that were too distinct, and so it made more sense to just burn it all, which sounds suspiciously like a certain modern political party's take on education. You know, stop educating people so that they have fewer topics that they know well enough to have opinions on and thus to fight over. And people are unhappy because they are always fighting with one another, and they start self-censoring. And the really startling point of the way that Beatty talks about books and literature is that censorship started with the people, not with the government. It's about sameness. It's about eliminating sadness and thus inequity. And in this chapter, in chapter 5, we realize that people who are not born equal are made equal. We see funerals eliminated because they are a source of unhappiness. Death is forgotten as soon as it occurs. Bodies are unceremoniously thrown in the incinerator. And books are considered as morbid as corpses because they contain dead thoughts by dead authors, and there's no room for those thoughts to evolve. They just have to exist in their long form. And this is a society that idolizes fire and burning and change and the easy cleanliness of destruction. Remember, Montag's first thought in this book is it was a pleasure to burn. And the thing that he likes about that process is the change. When something goes from being whatever it was to then bright and on fire, and then dark, and he compares it to a butterfly going through metamorphosis. And Beatty explains in this chapter, fire is bright and fire is clean, and there's the sense that even though fire creates soot, which is dirty and it stains Montag's clothes and hands, the fire itself is clean. The fire is something to aspire to. And in the middle of this, Mildred, whose attention span, by the way, is shot, invites Beatty in, and they have a nice little conversation where Beatty is talking to Montag about, why you do this fireman work. And Mildred finds Montag's hidden book. Beatty pretends like he doesn't see her find it, but then he tells Montag that every fireman goes through it. Every fireman goes through this process of questioning and is allowed to keep a book for 24 or 48 hours, just a day or two, but that if this fireman does not burn that book, then the rest of the unit will show up to do it. And Montag, in this same chapter, reveals that actually he's got like 20 or so books. Anyway, Beatty leaves. Montag shows Mildred the rest of the books. Mildred is plainly uncomfortable with it. And there's sort of a scratching sound at the door. There's like a hiss. And Montag doesn't answer, neither does Mildred. Later, it becomes very clear that the hound has been sniffing around Montag in his house for a while, probably since the very first time that he talked to Clarice. And you can really track it by every time that there's a scratch at the door or a hissing noise at the door. Yeah, that's the hound following them around. And then we get into section 2, which is called The Sieve and the Sand. Again, titles are important, just like The Hearth and the Salamander. This one refers to Montag's own childhood memory of trying to fill a sieve with sand. And he's reminded of this as he's trying to read the book that he stole from that woman's house on the train. Because he's going on the train to see a professor that he met like a couple of years ago. And the book that he's reading turns out to be the Bible. And that's a really interesting point of comparison to TV Jesus, where Montag also begins to realize that, oh my God, wait, there can be more than one interpretation of a source text. TV Jesus isn't the only Jesus in the world. And I think it's really interesting to look at that chapter and compare, actual biblical brown socialist love thy neighbor Jesus to the version that Fox News ascribes to. And like, if we only ever saw televangelist Jesus on a screen, we would never know about brown socialist love thy neighbor Jesus. I'm Jewish, so, my interpretation of this is going to be a little bit skewed anyway. But in any case, Montag realizes that he literally cannot hold on to all of the thoughts that he's having about this Bible book because his attention span is also shot. He's trying to trap all of these thoughts, but it's like sand running through a sieve. Chapter 1 of this section, Mildred complains that she likes the people on her TV better than she likes books, and there are pretty colors and it's easier to hold her attention. And Montag feels like the books that he's been collecting and stealing must somehow be able to help him out of his own state of ignorance. And so he calls the professor that he talked to in the park a couple of years ago named Faber. And the reason he talked to Faber in the park was because he saw this guy reading. And Montag had to reassure him a couple times over that oh, no, I'm not going to report you. I'm not going to take your book. I'm not going to burn it. Again, it's becoming very clear that maybe Montag was having some little bitty revolutionary thoughts well before the book actually began. And the professor gave Montag his number and his address. And Montag calls him and he asks, hey, how many copies are left of any of these books in the country? And Faber assumes that Montag is trying to trap him, goes, there are none, hangs up. And Montag thinks about it and realizes that maybe the copy of the Bible that he's holding is the last one left in the country, maybe on the planet. And so he goes a little bit crazy. He's literally screaming at people on the bus to shut up. And he goes to Faber and he goes to the address that he has written down and he shows him the book. And Faber realizes oh no, this is a guy taking his little baby steps into revolution mode. And Montag asks Faber to teach him to understand what he reads, not just how to read it, but how to comprehend what he's reading, how to revive his attention span. And Faber realizes, and I think this is really important, that it's not the books themselves that Montag is looking for, it's the meaning that they contain. That same meaning could be found in television, in radio, in other forms of long-form media, complex media, but there's no further demand for complexity in media, and you don't really have control over what goes on your screen. It's from a pre-selected menu. So if it's not popular anymore, it disappears from the menu. Part of the reason why there's so much opposition to books from this society is because the books stick around even if you don't like what they have to say anymore. And Faber compares the society to flowers trying to live on flowers instead of growing in dirt. It's not necessarily going to make you happy every time, reality. The unpleasant stuff in life is how you learn, it's how you grow, it's how you change your interpretation of things. But if you're not willing to deal with how unpleasant it can be, you never grow. You slowly run out of nutrients and your brain eventually kind of offs itself. And Montag realizes, and Faber says it outright, that Faber is a coward. He's hiding. And so Montag starts bullying Faber. He literally rips pages out of this precious last remaining Bible until Faber agrees to help Montag find other pieces of a revolution. And Montag decides that it's going to be okay. He's going to risk upsetting Beatty. He's going to go back to work, but he's going to try and make a change. He's going to try and make a stand. And so he ends up with Faber in a little earpiece in his head. And Faber is kind of introduced out of nowhere in this chapter. But I think it becomes really clear that years prior, in this short little conversation with Montag in a park, he planted little itty bitty seeds of revolution because Montag saw him reading, saw him invested in something and went, oh my God, you're invested in something. Let me ask you questions about it. And then he proceeded to not report him. And then just a couple of years later, Clarice, with her desire for slow hobbies and slow time spent in nature, sort of watered those seeds. And now Montag is a flower able to live on dirt and unpleasant things and soot and ash, which, by the way, can be helpful nutrients for soil, but not when they're choking out all of the nutrients. And Montag's little flower has been watered, and now he's trying to grow. And there's a really important thing there about Clarice and her slow hobbies. We can talk about that in a minute. Slow hobbies are, in a lot of ways, really key to understanding delayed gratification and being able to make effective change. It's one of the first pieces of advice that I have for anybody who wants to get into organizing and wanting to make a difference in society. First things first, especially if you are Gen Z or younger, get a slow hobby. Learn how to process really, really, really delayed gratification for yourself, because change doesn't happen overnight. Anyway, Montag's attention span is not as far gone as Mildred's. It's not great. The chapter title is, again, a reference to trying to pour sand through a sieve. Only so much can stick around. And he tries on the bus or the subway, whatever it is, I think it's the subway, to read this Bible as fast as he can, not because he's afraid that he's going to be discovered or reported, but because he doesn't think that he can retain any of the information long enough to think about it, long enough to process it. Now, I said that his attention span is not as far gone as Mildred's. Let's talk about Mildred, because in the second chapter of this section, at first it seems like Mildred means well. And frankly, she's trying to figure out why her husband even cares about all of these books, why there are all of these books in her house. But then, after a really kind of alarming episode where it becomes clear that Montag is not capable of being a sneaky, subtle operative, he yells at Mildred's friends and tries to make them read books, even though it's like really plainly illegal. And it becomes really clear after Mildred lies to her friends about the books and says like, oh, no, it's fine. Firemen can bring home books from time to time. Mildred has been burning the books in the backyard one by one. And then Montag goes to work and he gives Beatty a fake Bible to burn that. And Beatty throws it in the trash, and Montag gets in a salamander, a fire truck, and they go off to work. They go off to burn things. And the address that has been input into the salamander's GPS is Montag's own house. And Mildred's primary complaint when Montag confronts her and goes, oh my God, did you call the fire unit? And Mildred says that the books are hard to absorb, and they make her feel stupid. And it makes her feel stupid that Montag understands them and she doesn't. And this is the chapter where Bradbury starts to get kind of weirdly biblical about it. We have Faber literally in Montag's ear, quoting the book of Job, all about duty and war. And then we have Beatty right in front of him, spouting quotes that he's memorized, more for the purpose of beating up and confusing Montag than anything else. And it's very like angel on one shoulder, devil on the other. And Beatty's use of literature against Montag is brilliant because it is the most powerful weapon he has against all of Montag's doubts. It's like, here, you don't understand all of these things. I understand all of these things. Don't you feel stupid now because I understand all of these things and I can quote all of them and you can't? And like that tactic has worked. That is the same logic that made Mildred want to call the fire unit on Montag. But at this point, Montag also realizes that, like, no, he's committed to something. He's going to make a stand. He's going to do something. And Beatty references Icarus because Beatty says, well, now you did it. Old Montag wanted to fly near the sun, and now that he's burnt his damn wings, he wonders why. Didn't I hint enough when I sent the hound around your place? And Mildred is the one who's reported Montag. Beatty's the one who's been sending the hound around. And it becomes really clear Beatty was never, ever, even for a second, a potential ally or a friend. He has been baiting and leading on Montag the entire time. It was always going to end like this from the second that Montag stopped and spoke to Clarice outside of her house. And he says, what is there about fire that's so lovely? No matter what age we are, what draws us to it? It's perpetual motion, the thing man wanted to invent but never did. It's a mystery. Scientists give us gobbledygook about friction and molecules, but they don't really know. Its real beauty is that it destroys responsibility and consequences. A problem gets too burdensome, then into the furnace with it. Now, Montag, you're a burden. And he tells Montag to burn down his own house. The hound is in the neighborhood, so like, don't try anything. And then he tries to arrest Montag after having Montag set his own house on fire. And Montag also notes that, like, he still enjoys burning. The fact that it is his own house and his own books give their emotional attachment to it, but he still likes the burn. But this is a change. And he says that he cuts off its terrible emptiness. and gives the entire room a gift of one huge bright flower of burning. And then Beatty, tries to arrest Montag. And Montag turns the flamethrower on Beatty. And Beatty's making it really clear that he likes burning. He likes having the authority to do any of this stuff. But he doesn't really derive any great pleasure in harming Montag. Montag is a burden to be gotten rid of. It's not really a personal vendetta. And Montag sets Beatty on fire. He kills him. And Beatty has also used this opportunity to eavesdrop on the little ear connection that Montag has with Faber. And it becomes, again, very clear that this is a surveillance state. The reason why Montag was always going to be doomed from the second that he talked to Clarice is because the Hound had been watching Clarice. And the second that Montag stopped and talked to Clarice, the Hound started watching him. And so there's something interesting to be said about there being just a constant state of surveillance everywhere that immediately turns into reality TV. And so Montag tries to save a couple of books, and in the middle he realizes that Beatty had wanted to die because Beatty just stood there. And I'm on 116 of my copy. He says, Beatty stood there, not really trying to save himself, just stood there, joking, needling. How strange to want to die so much that you let a man walk around armed with a flamethrower and a gun, and then instead of shutting up and staying alive, you go on yelling at people and making fun of them until you get them mad. And Montag realizes that Beatty was never happy. Beatty was never content. Not that it justifies it, obviously, but the emptiness that was starting to bother Montag had to some extent also been bothering Beatty for a really, really long time. And then Montag starts to see and hear things through the windows of other houses. And he starts to realize that his own police chase, the police are after him, his own police chase is being presented as entertainment. Montag is able to watch the mechanical Hound track him by glancing at other people's house windows into their TV parlors. Literally, everybody is watching this televised chase. And so he wades into the river to try to get rid of his scent. And he avoids the searchlights and he walks towards the railroad tracks. Again, a slower, older method of transportation. And he's overwhelmed by the sights and the sounds and the smells of nature. Because again, Clarice was weird for wanting to go walk outside. Clarice was weird for wanting to go spend time in nature. And as Montag walks, it starts to occur to him that Clarice probably walked here. And the railroad tracks lead him to a little fire with 5 men sitting around it. And this is where we meet Granger, who has been leading a revolution for this entire time. And we have not met or heard of Granger until this very last chapter because the revolution has been happening maybe 2 miles away from Montag's house, but not in his uber-mechanized, superimposed onto the TV world. So Montag didn't realize it. Montag didn't know. And Granger gives Montag a fluid that changes his chemical composition, that makes him, to the mechanical Hound and to the society around them, not Montag. And Montag realizes that in this moment, he is literally different than he was even 2 weeks ago, down to the very cells in his body. And this is where we also start to realize that this society cares more about propaganda and the image of having shut things down more than actually having shut them down. Because the camera on the TV zooms in on a man walking down the street, smoking a cigarette, walking by himself, alone. And the announcer on the TV introduces or identifies this guy as Montag. And the Hound appears from the side of the screen and pounces at not Montag. And the announcer declares to society that Montag is dead, the crime against society has been avenged. And the men around the circle, who are homeless, they are houseless, they are communityless in the eyes of society, but they have a community with each other that people in the society don't have and never had. And they acknowledge that the police probably chose that guy to be their scapegoat because he walked by himself. He didn't have the protection of community. And you get this really clear point where you realize that this society cares about propaganda more than they care about reality, which that thought's sort of been building through the book, but this is the point where it becomes really clear. And I personally think that that is a good signifier that, just like I mentioned earlier, society is not as far gone as Montag certainly believes it to be, because Montag has never known about this revolution, but the revolution wasn't televised. The revolution wasn't put up on the walls of the TV parlor. And because of this newscast, we don't know how much of the news and nonfiction presented by government and society in this book is even real. The dead thoughts by dead authors are still there to be thought about and argued with. And here in the very last little tiny bit of the book, we find Montag meeting people who are trying to save literature by remembering books one little phrase, one little sentence at a time. And these men welcome Montag into their community, only for an atomic bomb to fall on the city, reducing everything to rubble and, crucially, ashes. And the next morning, Montag leads all of these men on foot back towards the city, which we can interpret as a holy city post-apocalypse, but we can also just refer to them coming back as a phoenix to bring what they can of pre-burning society to whoever survived, if anybody survived. And I think that it's a really hopeful ending for a book that is otherwise incredibly depressing. Because yes, the primary point of the book is horror at what has been happening to people's attention spans and to literature in the modern world. But it's also very much about isolationism and how rebels, particularly intellectuals, are never as alone as it might seem. So I think there's a lot of questions that it leaves behind. How much of an attention span can be saved when we're living in the era of the iPad kid? Does this book have a happy ending? And to be clear, I don't really find that the point of this book is, oh, you're a sheeple if you indulge in lazy or pleasurable experiences, which a lot of people do interpret this book that way. But Faber literally talks about how what Montag needed wasn't the actual books, but their content. It was the unmoderated, uncensored message that makes you want to think and feel things for yourself rather than being a passive listener. And I think that that comes through really well. I find this book a call to action in a lot of ways that I think is really important. And more than anything, I think that it's a call to stop self-censoring, to read things for which we are not the target audience, to read things that make us uncomfortable. And that, I think, is really important. And that makes me really glad that this book has survived for, 70 odd years at this point. So what did you think of Fahrenheit 451? Did I leave anything out that you wanted me to talk about and I didn't? Is there anything that I left out that my English teacher or your English teacher would be screaming if they realized that I didn't talk about? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next one.